What made you kick your sibling out of the family? My older sister Jessica basically raised us 3 kids because our mom was never around. She'd make our lunches, sign our permission slips, even bought my brother Mason his EpiPens with her waitressing money. Well, last Saturday I was babysitting Mason when it happened. We were at the park and some kid shared his granola bar. Mason was 6 bites in when his face started swelling. "Where's your EpiPen?" I asked, already checking his backpack. His eyes went wide with panic. "Jessica has it. She said she'd bring it." My stomach dropped. Jessica was supposed to meet us at noon. It was 12:17. I called her immediately. Restaurant noise and laughter filled the phone. This better be important. "Mason's having a reaction. Where are you with his EpiPen?" "I'm on a date, finally, after 3 years." "Jessica, he ate peanuts. His throat is closing. Are you kidding me right now? You're supposed to be here, with his medication. I'm supposed to be 22 and having a life. This is the first time James could get reservations at this place. He needs his EpiPen now. I've been raising you kids since I was 16. 16. This is literally the only afternoon I've had to myself in months. Jessica, please, no. You know what? I'm tired of this. Every time I try to be happy, something happens. Every single time. At 12:23, Mason collapsed. His lips were blue. A mom at the park called 911 while I held him, feeling his tiny chest barely moving. I called Jessica again. "He's unconscious. He's turning blue." "Stop being dramatic. You always do this when I'm finally doing something for myself." "This is an emergency. Everything's an emergency when I'm not available." Funny how that works. The paramedics arrived at 12:31. The EMT's face went pale when she checked his airways. "He needs epinephrine now. You don't have any?" "My sister has it. She's coming." But she wasn't. I called her at 12:35, sobbing. The paramedic took my phone. "Ma'am, your brother is in anaphylactic shock. His airways are closing. We need that EpiPen immediately." Jessica's response was loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been his mother since our actual mother checked out. Don't lecture me about what he needs." "Ma'am, he will die without—" "I haven't had a real date in 3 years. 3 years. I deserve 2 hours. 2 hours to be a normal person. Ma'am, I'll leave when dessert's done." At 12:42, they intubated him in the ambulance. His little body was so still. The EMT kept checking her watch, then his vitals, then her watch again. At 12:48, his heart stopped. They got it going again, but the EMT's eyes told me everything. "How far is your sister?" I texted Jessica a photo of Mason on the stretcher. "He's dying." She texted back. "This is exactly why I never get to be happy. I finally meet someone who doesn't know I'm raising 3 kids, and you ruin it." Then, "James just asked why I'm crying. Thanks for that." Then, "I'll come when we're done eating." Jessica finally showed up at the ER at 1:33 p.m., perfect makeup ruined by tears, her date dropping her off. She threw the EpiPen bag at the nurse. "Here, happy now? He thinks I'm a teen mom. Date's ruined." The doctor emerged, his scrubs still bloody. "We need to discuss organ donation." Jessica laughed. "What? Just give him the shot." "Ma'am, your brother went 51 minutes without epinephrine. He's brain dead." Jessica whipped toward me. "This is your fault. You were watching him. You had his EpiPens. You were supposed to be there. I'm always supposed to be there. When do I get to live? When is it my turn?" "Ma'am," the doctor interrupted, "the window for organ donation is closing. I gave up everything for these kids. Everything. My college, my 20s, my entire life. And the one time, I take 3 hours for myself." She was already on her phone. "I need to call Mom's lawyer. The paramedics should have had epinephrine." At 2:45 p.m., while Jessica was back with James, because the date wasn't actually over when you interrupted, they unplugged the machines. Mason died at 6 years old because his protector chose herself over his life. I sat with his body for 3 hours. Jessica never came back. She texted once. "James doesn't want to date someone with baggage. Thanks for ruining the only good thing in my life." That's when I decided I wasn't just going to bury my baby brother. I was going to bury her too, and she just gave me everything I needed to do it. The hospital chapel was empty and cold at 3 in the morning, but I couldn't leave Mason's body alone in that basement morgue. My phone screen hurt my eyes in the dark as I scrolled through Jessica's texts from earlier. Every single message she sent while Mason was dying needed to be saved before she could delete them or claim she never said those things. I took screenshot after screenshot, my fingers shaking as I captured her saying she'd come after dessert was done. The one where she blamed me for ruining her date made my stomach turn, but I saved it anyway. 27 screenshots total, each one showing the exact time she sent it while Mason's airways were closing. I opened 3 different cloud services on my phone and uploaded every screenshot to each one, then emailed copies to myself at 2 different email addresses. My laptop was at home, so I used the hospital's computer in the family waiting area to create a new folder labeled Evidence. The keyboard keys clicked too loud in the quiet hallway as I typed out everything I could remember with exact times. Mason's reaction started at 12:17, and Jessica was called immediately, but refused to leave her date. The paramedics arrived at 12:31 and needed the EpiPen she had with her. Mason's heart stopped at 12:48, and they got it beating again, but he was brain dead by then. Jessica arrived at 1:33 p.m., 70 minutes after his reaction started, still talking about her ruined date with James. I wrote down every word I could remember her saying, every excuse she made, every time she chose herself over saving Mason's life. My phone buzzed with a text from Catalina Arias, the mom from the park who had called 911 while I held Mason. She said she couldn't stop thinking about what happened and asked if I was okay. I called her right there in the hospital hallway, even though it was past 3 in the morning. She answered on the second ring and said she hadn't been able to sleep either. I asked if she would write down what she saw and heard at the park. She immediately agreed and said she could still hear Jessica's voice through my phone speaker, saying she deserved 2 hours to be normal. Catalina had been close enough to hear everything when the paramedic took my phone, and Jessica said she'd leave when dessert was done. She promised to write it all down and email it to me by tomorrow morning, said she'd include every detail she could remember. The next morning, I waited until 9 before calling Jessica, because I wanted her to be fully awake for this. I set my phone to record before dialing since one-party consent recording is legal in our state. She answered with her voice all rough from crying or maybe drinking. I told her we needed to talk about Mason's funeral arrangements. She immediately started screaming that this was all my fault for not watching him properly. Her voice got louder as she yelled about sacrificing everything for us kids since she was 16. She said she deserved a life after giving up her college dreams and her 20s to raise us. I let her rant for 10 minutes straight, recording every word as she admitted she knew he was dying, but stayed at the restaurant anyway. She kept saying she finally met someone who didn't know about her raising 3 kids, and I ruined it for her. When she finally stopped yelling, I told her the funeral home needed decisions today. She hung up on me, but I had everything I needed recorded on my phone. I spent the next 6 hours at my kitchen table with my laptop researching child endangerment and negligent homicide laws. The legal definitions matched exactly what Jessica did to Mason. Child endangerment included knowingly placing a child in danger or failing to act when a child needs help. Negligent homicide covered causing someone's death through criminal negligence, which meant ignoring an obvious risk of death. Jessica knew Mason would die without his EpiPen and chose to stay at her restaurant date anyway. Every website I found said the same thing about duty of care and how she violated it. The CPS website had a hotline number that was answered 24 hours a day. I called and spent over an hour telling the intake worker everything that happened. I read Jessica's texts word for word while the worker typed them into her system. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, and I gave her every single timestamp I had documented. She wanted to know about our living situation, and I explained how Jessica had been our guardian since Mom left. The worker gave me a case number and said an investigator would contact me within 48 hours. She also said I should file a police report immediately if I hadn't already done so. The police station smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner when I walked in with my folder of evidence. The officer at the desk looked tired, but got more alert as I explained why I was there. I showed him all the screenshots, the timeline I'd written, and played part of the recorded phone call. He called over a sergeant who looked at everything and said this needed to go to the detective unit. They took my formal statement, which took almost 2 hours to complete with all the details. The officer gave me a case number and said a detective would follow up within a few days. 2 days later, my phone rang, and it was Judith Sterling from CPS saying she needed to schedule a home visit. We set it for the next day, and she said to have all my documentation ready for her to review. I spent that whole night organizing everything into a binder with labeled tabs for texts, call recordings, timeline, and witness statement from Catalina. Judith showed up exactly on time the next morning with a thick folder and a tablet for taking notes. She interviewed me for 2 solid hours, going through every piece of evidence and taking photos of the screenshots with her tablet. She asked about our youngest sister, Gianna, who was only 8 and still living at home with Jessica. Judith's face got more serious as she reviewed the evidence, and she said she was implementing an immediate safety plan. Jessica couldn't be alone with Gianna anymore until the investigation was complete. She would need supervised visits only, and someone else would have to be present at all times. Judith gave me her direct number and said to call immediately if Jessica violated the safety plan. 3 days after Mason died, the funeral home called, saying they needed decisions about his service. But Jessica and I couldn't agree on anything. She wanted a big viewing where she could cry and tell everyone how hard her life had been raising us. I wanted something small to actually honor Mason, not turn it into Jessica's victim show. We ended up planning completely separate viewings because there was no way I could stand next to her while she pretended to be the grieving guardian. The day of Mason's funeral came way too fast, and I stood in the back of the funeral home watching relatives file in. My Aunt Helen grabbed Jessica's hands and told her she was a saint for raising us all these years. while Uncle Pete just stared at me with this look that said he knew exactly what happened. More family showed up, and they split into two groups, with half of them crowding around Jessica while she sobbed about how she gave up everything for us kids, and the other half coming to me quietly to say they were sorry about Mason. Catalina walked in carrying white flowers and made her way straight to me, leaning close to whisper that she'd testify to whatever I needed, because what she heard that day still made her sick. The service itself was awful, with Jessica up front, wailing about how she'd been more of a mother to Mason than our actual mom ever was, while I sat in the back row trying not to scream that she killed him for a dinner date. After the burial, I got a call from someone named Brad Wallace, who said he was with the district attorney's office and wanted to schedule an intake meeting for next week to discuss the case. I spent the next 3 days barely sleeping while I organized every piece of evidence into this huge binder with colored tabs separating the screenshots, call recordings, timeline charts, and witness information from Catalina. The meeting was set for Thursday morning, and I showed up with my binder plus backup copies of everything on 2 different flash drives just in case. Brad's office was small and packed with file boxes, but he cleared space on his desk and spent 2 hours going through every single piece of evidence I had. He explained that to prove criminal negligence, we needed to show Jessica had a legal duty to protect Mason, that she knew he would die without the EpiPen, and that she chose to ignore that risk anyway. Brad asked if he could download all the data from my phone to preserve the original files and timestamps, and I signed the consent forms right away, desperate for someone to finally take this seriously. He made copies of everything and said he'd be in touch once he reviewed it all with his supervisor. 2 days later, Judith called to tell me Catalina had officially agreed to be a witness for the CPS case and would provide a sworn statement about what she heard at the park. Having someone else who heard Jessica refuse to leave her date even though Mason was dying felt like the first real proof that I wasn't crazy or making this bigger than it was. Brad called the following week to say he'd gotten the official 911 call records and EMT run sheets, which confirmed every single timestamp I'd given him down to the minute. The medical records from the hospital showed Mason's condition got worse, exactly like I described, with his heart stopping at 12:48 and brain death happening around 12:50, just like the EMT had told me. Meanwhile, Jessica started posting all over social media about how her ungrateful brother was harassing her after she sacrificed her whole youth to raise us when Mom walked out. She wrote these long posts about how she gave up college and dating and her 20s to be our parent, but left out the part where she let Mason die because she wanted to finish her dessert. Her friends were commenting with hearts and support, while I screenshot every single post for my evidence file. Then this guy showed up at my door with legal papers, a process server who handed me a cease and desist letter from Jessica's lawyer demanding I stop defaming her and making false accusations. I was about to panic when my phone rang, and it was Alina Sterling, who turned out to be Theodore Sterling's daughter and a family attorney, offering to help me respond to Jessica's letter. She came to my apartment that afternoon and reviewed everything, then wrote a response saying I was cooperating with legal authorities and had every right to seek justice for my brother through proper channels. The anger was eating me alive, though, keeping me up at night planning all the ways I wanted to destroy Jessica, so Alina gave me the name of a grief counselor named Jonah Weber. I started seeing him twice a week, and at first all I could talk about was how much I hated Jessica and wanted her to suffer like Mason did. Jonah listened without judging and slowly helped me understand that wanting justice and processing grief weren't the same as revenge, and that I could do both without letting the anger consume me. Over several sessions, he helped me reframe my goal from destroying Jessica to protecting Gianna and getting justice for Mason through the legal system. This shift in thinking helped me focus on using the courts and CPS effectively, instead of just lashing out in anger, which would only hurt my case. Then Judith called with news that made everything even more urgent, because Jessica had shown up 2 hours late to pick up Gianna from the school, leaving our 8-year-old sister sitting alone in the office. The school had documented everything and called CPS immediately, which meant Jessica had violated the safety plan that said she couldn't be alone with Gianna. Judith said this violation would strengthen their case for increased oversight and possibly removing Gianna from Jessica's care completely, which was exactly what I wanted. Brad called 3 days later while I was making Gianna's lunch for school and told me the homicide unit had picked up the case for review. He said they were looking at felony child endangerment charges that could mean real prison time, but warned me these cases take months to build and I needed to be patient. The evidence was strong, though, especially with all the timestamps and witness statements we'd collected. I was outside the grocery store the next week, buying more school supplies for Gianna, when Jessica came out of nowhere screaming at me in the parking lot. She was yelling about how I'd ruined her life and turned everyone against her, and that Mason's death was my fault for not watching him better. I stayed calm and pulled out my phone to record her whole meltdown while she kept screaming that she'd given up everything for us ungrateful kids. When she finally stormed off, I drove straight to the police station and filed a harassment report with the video as evidence. The officer said they'd add it to the growing file on Jessica. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. 2 days after that, I met with an estate attorney about Mason's things and the life insurance money from when our dad died 5 years ago. Jessica was supposed to be the beneficiary as our guardian, but the attorney said she had a major conflict of interest now since she was responsible for his death. He explained we could petition the court for a neutral administrator to handle everything instead of Jessica. I spent the whole weekend gathering all of Jessica's texts and the timeline evidence to support the petition, and we filed it Monday morning. The court clerk said they'd schedule a hearing for next month to decide who should control Mason's estate. That same afternoon, a courier showed up with a thick envelope from Jessica's lawyer, threatening to sue me for defamation if I didn't stop talking about the case. The letter said I was spreading lies and trying to destroy Jessica's reputation when she'd sacrificed everything to raise us. I called Alina immediately, and she came over to review it. She said to stay quiet on social media, but keep cooperating with all the official investigations since truth was our defense against any lawsuit. Brad called again the following week with amazing news because the phone company had provided complete records of my calls with Jessica that day. The records showed exactly when I called her, how long each call lasted, and most importantly, that she never tried to call 911 or anyone else for help. She stayed on the phone with me hearing Mason was dying, but never left the restaurant or called for medical help herself. This was huge evidence of her negligence. I started meeting with Jonah twice that week to work on a victim impact statement for the future court proceedings. Writing down all the things Mason would never get to do broke me completely. He'd never learn to ride a bike without training wheels, or go to middle school, or have his first crush, or learn to drive, or graduate, or get married, or have kids of his own. Jonah helped me put it all into words that would help the court understand exactly what Jessica's selfishness had stolen from the world. Catalina came to the prosecutor's office to give her sworn statement, and I sat in the waiting room while she was inside for 2 hours. When she came out, she hugged me and said she'd told them everything about hearing Jessica say she'd finished dessert before coming to help Mason. She confirmed Jessica sounded annoyed, not worried, when I was screaming that Mason was dying. The prosecutor said Catalina's testimony would be crucial for proving Jessica understood the emergency, but chose to ignore it. Meanwhile, Jessica was missing shifts at the restaurant for all her legal meetings and court dates. Her manager finally fired her after she no-showed 3 times in 2 weeks. Of course, she went straight to Facebook to post about how I'd destroyed her life and cost her the job she needed to survive. She wrote this long rant about how she'd raised us since she was 16, and this was the thanks she got, but she never mentioned that her own choices about Mason were why she was in legal trouble. Her friends kept commenting with hearts and support, while I screenshot everything for evidence. Judith called to schedule a meeting at Gianna's school with the principal and counselor to discuss supervised arrangements. When I got there, they explained that Gianna had been acting out in class and crying randomly since Mason died. The counselor said she needed stability and routine, which meant keeping her with me instead of bouncing between houses. They were recommending to the court that Jessica only have supervised visits at a neutral location for Gianna's safety and mental health. I realized, sitting in that meeting, that protecting Gianna had become just as important as getting justice for Mason, because she was only 8 and had already lost one brother to Jessica's selfishness. 2 days later, Brad called me to his office downtown, and I sat across from him while he explained the charges they were moving forward with. He said the DA's office decided on felony child endangerment, resulting in death, instead of negligent homicide, because it would be easier to prove in court. The disappointment must have shown on my face because he quickly added that it still carried up to 10 years in prison and would make Jessica a felon for life. I understood the strategy, even though part of me wanted them to go for the maximum charges possible. The following week, we had the probate hearing for Mason's estate, and the judge spent 40 minutes reviewing all the evidence I'd submitted about Jessica's texts and calls during his death. When he announced he was appointing a neutral administrator instead of Jessica, she jumped up from her chair and started screaming that I was stealing from her after everything she'd sacrificed for us. The bailiff had to escort her out while she kept yelling about how she'd raised us since she was 16, and this was the thanks she got. 3 days after that, my phone rang with an unknown number, and it turned out to be a reporter from the local paper asking about Mason's case. I told her I couldn't comment and gave her Brad's number instead, because the last thing I needed was Jessica claiming I was trying to get famous off our brother's death. That same afternoon, a process server knocked on my door with legal papers, and I opened them to find Jessica had filed for a restraining order against me. The paperwork claimed I was harassing and stalking her when all I'd done was pursue justice through proper legal channels. I called Alina immediately, and she came over that evening to help me prepare a response with all my evidence, showing I'd never contacted Jessica directly, except for necessary legal matters. We spent the entire next week organizing everything for the restraining order hearing, sorting through months of call logs and getting written statements from witnesses. Alina kept reassuring me that any judge would see through Jessica's attempt to silence me, but I still felt sick thinking about facing her in court again. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, and I barely slept the night before, going over all the evidence one more time. When we got to court, Jessica's lawyer argued for 20 minutes about how I was destroying her life and reputation, but Alina calmly presented our evidence showing I'd only used legal channels. The judge took less than 10 minutes to deny Jessica's restraining order and actually turned to warn her against making false accusations to manipulate the legal system. He said I had every right to pursue justice for my brother through proper channels and that attempting to silence me with frivolous legal actions could result in penalties against her. Jessica stormed out of the courtroom, and I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in days. Brad called me the next Monday with news that made my stomach flip because the grand jury would convene next month, and I'd need to testify about everything that happened that day at the park. The thought of reliving those moments in front of strangers terrified me, but Mason deserved to have his story told in court. I started seeing Jonah twice a week to prepare for the testimony, and he spent our sessions teaching me breathing techniques to stay calm on the stand. He showed me how to stick to facts and let the evidence speak, instead of getting emotional, which would be the hardest part for me. We practiced over and over with him playing the role of the defense attorney, trying to twist my words while I learned to stay focused on the truth. Meanwhile, Brad was building the case, and he called to say he was subpoenaing James to testify about what happened at the restaurant while Mason was dying. James tried everything to avoid the subpoena, even having his lawyer claim he barely knew Jessica and had nothing relevant to add. But the court order was clear, and James had no choice but to show up for his deposition or face contempt charges. I wasn't allowed in the room during his deposition, but Brad called me afterward to share what happened. James had confirmed under oath that Jessica knew Mason was having a severe allergic reaction and that I'd called multiple times begging for help. He admitted she insisted on ordering and eating dessert, even after being told Mason was dying, and that she'd said she deserved one afternoon to herself after raising us for years. His testimony was exactly what we needed to prove Jessica understood the emergency, but chose to ignore it for her own selfish reasons. 3 days later, Judith called to tell me Jessica had left Gianna home alone again, while she went to a bar with friends from work. The neighbor had seen Jessica leave around 8 at night and called CPS when Gianna knocked on their door at 10, asking for help opening a can of soup. Judith drove over immediately and found empty wine bottles in the kitchen and Gianna watching TV by herself in the dark because she didn't know how to replace the burnt-out light bulb. Jessica stumbled in at 1 a.m, drunk and angry that Judith was there documenting everything with photos and notes. She kept saying she deserved to have fun after everything she'd been through, and that Gianna was old enough to take care of herself for a few hours. Judith added this violation to the growing file and told me it was exactly what they needed to show a pattern of neglect that went beyond just Mason's death. The next week, CPS filed an official petition with family court requesting that Jessica only be allowed supervised visitation with Gianna based on the documented safety violations and the pending criminal charges. I spent 2 days organizing all my evidence into neat folders with tabs for each incident and made copies of every text message and photo I had. Alina helped me write a statement supporting the petition where I detailed all the times Jessica had put her own needs ahead of the kids' safety over the years. The court scheduled the hearing for the same week as the grand jury proceedings, which meant everything was happening at once. Brad called to prep me for my grand jury testimony and warned it would be intense since I'd have to walk through every minute of that day at the park. I practiced my timeline over and over, memorizing the exact sequence of events and making sure I could stay calm while describing Mason's final moments. The morning of the grand jury, I threw up twice from nerves, but forced myself to eat some toast and drive to the courthouse. I sat in the witness chair for 3 hours, going through every detail, while the prosecutor showed my photos and texts on a big screen. Jessica's attorney kept trying to make it seem like I was exaggerating or misremembering things, but I stuck to the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. When they showed the photo I'd taken of Mason on the stretcher, several jurors gasped, and one woman started crying. The prosecutor asked me to read Jessica's texts out loud, where she said she'd come after dessert was done, even though she knew Mason was dying. My voice shook, but I got through them all while the jury members took notes and shook their heads. The next day, the EMT who'd worked on Mason testified about his condition when she arrived at the park. She explained in medical terms how his airways had closed and his organs were shutting down from lack of oxygen. She confirmed that if he'd gotten epinephrine within the first 10 minutes of the reaction, he would have survived with no permanent damage. The prosecutor asked her directly if Jessica arriving 70 minutes late was what killed Mason, and she said yes, without hesitation. She also testified about hearing Jessica say through my phone that she'd leave when dessert was done, which matched exactly what I'd told them. 2 days later, Brad called with the news that the grand jury had returned an indictment for felony child endangerment resulting in death. Jessica would face up to 10 years in prison, though Brad warned me that first-time offenders rarely got the maximum sentence. He said the fact that she'd been Mason's primary caregiver actually made the charges stronger since she had a legal duty to protect him. That same afternoon, we had the family court hearing about Gianna's custody, and Jessica showed up looking perfect with her hair done and wearing a conservative dress. The judge reviewed all the CPS reports and the criminal indictment before making his decision about visitation. Jessica's lawyer argued that she was a devoted sister who'd sacrificed her youth to raise her siblings, but the judge cut him off and said the evidence showed a pattern of putting herself first. He ordered that Jessica could only see Gianna during supervised visits twice a week at the CPS facility with a social worker present. Jessica jumped up and screamed that I'd turned everyone against her and that I was stealing her family. The judge banged his gavel and told her she'd done this to herself by choosing a date over her brother's life. He said the supervised visits would continue indefinitely, and any violations would result in losing all visitation rights. A week later, Brad called to say Jessica's attorney wanted to discuss a plea deal for 3 years probation and 500 hours of community service. I was so mad I threw my phone across the room because how could she kill Mason and not spend a single day in jail? Brad explained that trials were risky and expensive, and the prosecutor was considering the deal to guarantee a conviction. I called Jonah sobbing about how unfair it was that Jessica might walk free after what she did to Mason. He came over that night, and we talked for hours about what justice really meant in this situation. He helped me understand that probation wasn't freedom, since Jessica would have years of supervision and mandatory parenting classes. She'd have a felony record that would follow her forever and affect every job application and apartment rental for the rest of her life. He also pointed out that the goal was protecting Gianna and making sure Jessica couldn't hurt another child, which the plea deal would accomplish. 3 weeks later, we all gathered in court for Jessica to formally accept the plea agreement. She had to stand in front of the judge and admit that she knowingly delayed bringing Mason's EpiPen despite being told he was dying. Her voice was flat and angry as she read the statement her lawyer had prepared, never once looking at me or showing any real remorse. She kept adding comments about how she'd raised us and deserved a life until the judge warned her to stick to the prepared statement, or he'd reject the deal. The judge stared at Jessica for a long moment before speaking in a cold voice that made everyone in the courtroom go quiet. He said he'd reviewed all the evidence, and while the plea agreement avoided a trial, he wanted to be clear about the severity of what she'd done. He sentenced her to 5 years probation with strict conditions, including 500 hours of community service, specifically at an allergy awareness organization, where she'd have to face what her choices caused every single day. She also got mandatory counseling twice a week, and could never have unsupervised custody of any minor child again, not just Gianna, but any child ever. The judge ordered her to pay $10,000 to establish a memorial fund in Mason's name within 60 days or face immediate jail time. Jessica's face went white when he said the amount, but her lawyer grabbed her arm before she could speak. 2 weeks later, I set up the Mason Memorial Fund at our local bank with the mission of providing free EpiPens to families who couldn't afford them. The bank manager helped me with all the paperwork and said her own son had allergies, so she understood how expensive the medication was. Catalina was the first person to donate, bringing a check for $500 and saying Mason's death shouldn't be for nothing. She hugged me in the bank lobby, and we both cried while other customers pretended not to notice. Within a month, we'd raised enough to provide 20 families with free EpiPens, and the local news did a story about it without mentioning Jessica's name. Brad called to let me know CPS was closing their active investigation since the criminal case was resolved, but Jessica would stay on monitoring for her entire 5-year probation period. Judith came by my apartment to do the final paperwork and confirmed Gianna would stay with me as her primary guardian while I worked on getting legal guardianship through family court. She said the supervised visits at the CPS facility would continue twice a week, and Jessica hadn't missed any yet, but always spent the time complaining about how unfair everything was. That night, I went through all my evidence folders, the screenshots and recordings and witness statements that had consumed my life for months. I shredded most of it and deleted the revenge scenarios I'd written during my darkest moments when I'd imagined much worse things happening to Jessica. Setting boundaries meant no contact with her except for coordinating Gianna's visits through the CPS app they made us use. I changed my phone number and blocked her on everything else because there was nothing left to say between us. 3 months after the sentencing, the city council approved a small plaque at the park where Mason had his reaction. The Parks Department installed it near the playground with simple text about allergy awareness and keeping children safe, funded by donations to Mason's memorial. It didn't mention his name, but I knew why it was there every time I passed it on my walks with Gianna. The plaque was bronze and caught the afternoon sun in a way that reminded me of Mason's hair when he'd play on the swings. Jessica's lawyer sent an email 6 months into her probation with what he called an apology letter from his client. She wrote that she was sorry Mason died, but spent 3 paragraphs explaining how I'd ruined her life by involving the authorities when this could have stayed a family matter. She said the community service was humiliating, and the other volunteers treated her like a child killer, even though she'd raised us when no one else would. She blamed me for James leaving her, and for losing her job and her apartment, and having to move back with our mom who was suddenly interested in being a parent now that the hard work was done. I read it once, then deleted it without responding, because there was nothing to say that would change anything. Life slowly settled into routines with Gianna living in my second bedroom and going to therapy every Thursday while I went on Tuesdays. We ate dinner together every night and did homework at the kitchen table and watched movies on weekends like a normal family. The supervised visits happened without drama because Jessica knew one violation would end them completely. Gianna came back from them quiet and would go straight to her room, but her therapist said that was normal and healthy processing. The grief didn't disappear, but it stopped being the only thing I could think about every second of every day. Some mornings I'd wake up and make breakfast before remembering Mason was gone. Then I'd spot a stand at the stove crying into the eggs. 10 months after Mason died, I stood at his grave with fresh flowers and realized something important. The justice we got wasn't perfect, because Jessica only got probation and Mason was still dead and would never grow up or go to middle school or have his first crush. But it was enough because Jessica couldn't hurt another child, and Gianna was safe and thriving in 5th grade with friends and good grades. The Mason Memorial Fund had helped 43 families get EpiPens, and one mom sent a photo of her daughter's birthday party with a note saying her child was alive because of what we'd done. Mason's memory lived on through kids who got to keep breathing and playing and growing up because their families could afford the medicine that might save them. And that's today's wrap-up. Hopefully you took away a detail or two you can use. If that sounds good, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.